Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this Moving Words Writers Across Minnesota virtual series with the Great River Regional Library, featuring the talents this evening of Geoff Herbach, Shannon Gibney, Christopher Lehman, and Bao Fee. I'm Wendy Worden, Programs and Services Assistant at the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library, which is the Library of Congress designated Minnesota Center for the Book. As we get started today, we would like to acknowledge the Dakota people, indigenous keepers of the land from which we broadcast. This land was reserved by the Dakota in the Treaty of Traverse des Sioux, signed with the United States in 1851, and it remains sacred to them today. I also want to acknowledge the Ojibwe people, fellow indigenous inhabitants of this land. Dakota and Ojibwe people are the original stewards of stories in this place, now called Minnesota, and we at the Friends honor that tradition and the knowledge and values embedded in it as we work to lift up storytellers in our state today. The Friends has coordinated the year-long Minnesota Book Awards program for 14 years, and as Minnesota's Center for the Book, we produce programming that benefits all ages and reaches all corners of the state. This programming is supported by funding for the Center for the Book included in Minnesota's K-12 education bill. We are grateful to all the state representatives and senators who advocated for that funding. On to our main event. Just lost my notes. This series is made possible in part by the state of Minnesota through a grant to the Minnesota Department of Education, and additional support is provided by the Harlan Boss Foundation for the Arts and Education Minnesota. We will have reading and conversation followed by a Q&A with you, our audience. Biographies of each panelist will be posted in the chat, and we'll be following up the program with a brief survey to get your feedback. We have partnered with Next Chapter Bookseller in St. Paul to purchase books from our featured authors, so please visit their website or your favorite local bookseller to purchase books. We'll put links in the chat throughout the program as well, so please feel free to pop your questions there because we'll be monitoring that. To start things off, we'll have a brief reading and presentation from each author. First, I'd like to welcome Geoff Herbach, who writes the Stupid Fast series of young adult novels, among others. Geoff, welcome.
Must unmute myself. Okay. Hello. I'm happy to be here. Out in space, wherever I am. I guess I probably will talk for a little while first, and then maybe do a little bit of reading. My primary objective as an author over the course of, I guess it's been like last decade or so, has been to write for kids who don't want to read anything, which is terrible way to make money. But I think I'll talk a little bit about how I got there as an author. I always kind of wanted to be a writer. I was about 95% certain as a kid that I'd play professional football, and it didn't work out. It did not work out. But always sort of in the back of my head, I thought, well, if this football thing doesn't work out, maybe I'd like to be a writer. And I did. In high school, I got hit by this kid. It was this 1980s kid with a giant furry mustache, just huge, and these giant biceps. And he hit me so hard that the sky turned orange and yellow, and it was a Friday night, and I lay there for a little while and I cried, I think, because it hurt so much. And it was this kind of catalyzing moment where I thought, I'm going to be a writer. But it took years, and I did a research paper my senior year of high school and found out that the average American fiction writer made $1,100 a year, which, I thought, that's not too bad. My mother's like, where are you going to live? What are you going to do? And I thought, I'll live in an apartment and I will eat bread. And she's like, no, you won't be able to afford any of it. Um, and my dad at one point suggested that I'd be so depressed I would disappear in Canada. And I can't, that's a long story, how we wound up there. But he said that writers were depressed and I would fade away someplace to the north. Uh, but I just kept going, and it took me years and years and years to write a book, into my 30s. And when my first book came out and it was for adults, I took it to my dad and I was like, hey, check this out. Look, I wrote a book. And he's like, I know, I'm so proud. And I'm like, yeah, where am I? Um, and he said, you're in my living room. And I said, yeah, where's your living room? Uh, and he said, what are you getting at? And I said, it's not in Canada. And he had no recollection at all of telling me that I would disappear into Canada. But that book had taken so long. I did kind of wonder if I wanted to do it again. It was hard. It was a slog, and I kept. If there are writers out there, I just kept writing myself into corners and not being able to get out. At the same time, a group of friends and I had started writing comedy, and it was essentially just the same jokes I would have told in middle school, like vaguely a little like the dirty turned up a little bit, but pretty close to the same jokes I would have told in middle school. And we performed it, and it went pretty well, and we got an audience, and that audience kind of grew, and then one of us moved to New York, and so we started doing the show in New York, and it went well there too. And it seems so ridiculous that the dumb jokes that I would tell would pay me money. The problem was, at the same time, I had kids, who were, and the oldest one at this point was 12. Um, and I'd been divorced once, and that was hard. But I remarried, and my wife also had kids, so we had this big sort of gaggle of children in Minneapolis, and I kept going to New York, and I started thinking, wow, I'm missing my children grow up, and I kind of thought, wow, maybe I'm a bad person for missing my children grow up, because I would fly back and forth all the time. Um, I had a friend in seventh grade, named Marty, and he started out not being my friend. Man, how am I going to wrap this around in 4 minutes? Okay, my friend Marty was huge, and he hated me, actually. I was in seventh grade about 4'6", and I weighed about 100 pounds, and I was one of these kids who could not stop bouncing. I bounced and bounced and bounced and bounced. And Marty, who was a man, he was like 5'10" and weighed 180 pounds, leaned over to me one day in a biology class, and he said, if you don't stop bouncing, I'm going to kill you. Um, and if you're a bouncy child, as I was, if you're bouncy, what happens when somebody says stop bouncing is you start vibrating at a much higher frequency. So I just started, and I was like, thanks for letting me know. And then he'd do things like put me on the clock. It's 2:00. At 2:05, when the bell rings, you're going to die. Do you understand? And so I'd sit there and look at the clock like tick, tick, tick. And when the bell rang at 2:05, I'd jump out of my chair, just run as fast as I could away from him. And he couldn't catch me. And this went on for months and months. I'd wake up in the middle of the night like, oh my God, today's the day Marty's going to kill me. I'm going to die. If I'd see him down the hall, I'd run out of the building and run around the whole school and come in another entrance. I just picture the, principal sitting there in his office like, oh, there goes that kid again. As I ran by. One day I was kind of doing my stupid walk around the corner of the gym, and he was just in my face right in front of me. And I froze, and he leaned back and he went, bam, and he just punched me in the nose, and I fell over backwards, and I started bleeding all over the place. And then he bent over me, and I thought, here comes the death blow. And he picked me up to standing. And he said, you're pretty fast. And I'd just been physically assaulted. This was the 1980s, which apparently was fair to almost kill a kid in school. But all I could think is, Marty thinks I'm really fast. So I went out for track, and it turned out I was really fast, like faster than any other kid in my class. And and Marty and I slowly became friends. Like, and by the time we were in high school, we were best friends. And I was still just jumpy and goofy, and like sung in the Shakespeare choir. So I'd show up, in giant puffy shirts and like, hello. But Marty protected me, and it was wonderful. For me, he was horrible to every other person on the planet. He was just a classic bully. I remember him walking into school one time, and he asked me about a question he didn't have in Spanish. And in the middle of asking the question, he was like, bam, and this kid just hit the floor. And I thought, oh, what happened? And Marty said, he looked at me. So that was like the level of his analysis. He was terrible. We went to see, this is not like, it's not a, it's a movie with a lot of problems in it. It's problematic, but we went to see the movie The Breakfast Club, and there was something about that movie that moved him deeply. I think because people were nice in it, and he'd never noticed people being nice to each other. And at the end, he just started like weeping horribly. And I asked him what had happened, and he's like, "It's got to stop. It's got to stop." I didn't know what had to stop. But then the next week, I drove him to school, and we walked into the building, and there was this punk rock kid getting punched by the tight end on our football team, and Marty grabbed him and turned him around and said, "Not in my school." Marty started protecting every kid. He wouldn't let anybody be mean to anyone. He grew up and he became an English teacher and then a middle school principal. And yeah, pretty much. Batman. When I was writing the dirty jokes, I went actually to visit his school and talk about writing one time. And he's this giant bear of a man, and all these kids were coming up, and he was hugging them and saying, "It's going to be a great day today." And I thought, I write dirty jokes. I am a bad person. I'm a bad person. So I quit this show that I was writing in New York, and I decided I don't know what I'm gonna do. I'm just gonna live in Minneapolis. My son turned 13 about that year. And one morning he came out into the living room and he said, "Dad, you smell something?" And I was like, "Yeah." And he said, "What is it?" And I said, I don't know. And I started sniffing around the living room, and he sniffed around the kitchen. And as we passed each other, I said, "Dude, it's you." And he said, "What?" And he lifted up his left arm and was like, "Oh." And then he lifted up his right and he said, "It's fine." And I said, "Oh, your left armpit went through puberty last night." And he said, "What?" And I said, "Yeah, your right arm is still the right arm of a child, but your left arm went through puberty." And so I took him to Target in Richfield, and we went to get deodorant. A guy in a red shirt came up to us and said, "Hey, can I help you find something?" And I said, "Oh, my son's left armpit went through puberty last night, and so we're looking for deodorant." And my son was like, "Shut up." And so I thought, I'm just going to write my kid a story because he refuses to read. And I'm going to write a story about a kid who just grows really fast and his body changes, and all sorts of crazy stuff happens. And I'm going to put my friend Marty in it because Marty moves me. And the change that he went through moves me. And I'm going to put him in it. And I'm going to see if I can make my kid read. And it took me about 6 weeks to write a first draft of this book, Stupid Fast. And I gave it to my son, Leo, and he read it as fast as he could on his iPod, which I thought was stupid. But he did. And then he said, "Could you write another?" And I said, "Yes, I can." That book ended up becoming my first YA book. And every book that I sit down to write ends up being that kind of same thing where I think, maybe I can be a good person like my friend Marty now, and write a book that can help a kid who doesn't want to read. I think that's my 10 minutes, so I'm going to stop. But thanks. I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to be with these other writers who I adore.
Thank you. That was fun. I appreciate any stories about weird school kids, because that's where I'm at. It's okay. Our next writer this evening is Shannon Gibney, who also writes for young adults, but she writes essays and all kinds of other lovely things as well. Shannon, welcome.
My fearless assistant was waiting all this time, my 10-year-old. So thank you all.
Welcome, Shannon.
Okay, Boise. Wow. Yes. So thank you for entertaining us there. I'm actually going to read a bit from my new novel, and it's called Botched, and the noise will go down in the background here soon in a minute. We've got dogs and kids and all kinds of COVID living situation stuff that I'm sure you're all dealing with in your own way too. I discovered when I did my search, my birth search, I'm adopted, that my name at birth was Erin Powers. That was the name that my birth mother gave me. And so for this novel, I call it a speculative memoir. And so it's a very weird book. But there's two primary timelines. One timeline is Erin Powers growing up in Utica, New York in 1985 with my birth mom, and Patricia Powers. And then another timeline is quote unquote what really happened, Shannon Gibney growing up in Ann Arbor, Michigan in 1985. And there's, yeah, it's just an odd book. There's a wormhole that connects the different timelines and some other speculative elements. So I'm gonna read from a section of the book, which is in the Shannon Gibney section, what really happened. And it's one of the only sections. Boise, you were this close to getting TV taken away. So in this section that I'm going to read, the character Shannon Gibney has located her birth mother, Patricia Powers, but she sees this. You'll see this section. She sees sort of this phantom of herself. This is one of the. There's all these mirrors. This is sort of a carnival of mirrors in this book. So I will read it. And yeah, then we can move on and talk about it. Timeline 2, Shannon Gibney, Utica, New York, December 1994. I am 19. No, turn left, I tell Bobby, frantically peering at the mashed up map in my hands. I think Clinton is off of Newberry. Bobby turns the steering wheel of the '89 Toyota Corolla that my parents have let us drive from Ann Arbor all the way out to Utica, a 7.5-hour journey across the US and Canada that will ultimately end at my birth mother, Patricia Powers' house. Okay, yeah, I say, pointing ahead. I can see the sign right up there. Bobby swats my arm away, blocking her view of the road. She grumbles something under her breath and I grin. We have been best friends for 13 years now, and although we often laugh as sisters, we can bicker like them too. I see it, she says irritably. She downshifts into second gear and we rumble up the quiet suburban street. The houses are maybe 60 or 70 years old, sturdy single-family dwellings with small, snow-filled lawns. I've been to New York City to drop my older brother John off at college at Columbia, but I've never ventured to this part of the state before. I can't quite pinpoint how it feels different from the Midwest, but it definitely does. There's a kind of hum underneath everything, an electricity that animates this small working class town that I don't feel back in Ann Arbor. Bobby is a sophomore at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute in Troy, New York, where she's studying environmental science. When I told her I'd found out that my birth mom lived in Utica, the first thing she said was, "Oh my God, that's like an hour and a half from Troy. We have to visit." Then she caught herself in her breath. I mean, if you want to. If you decide you want to visit, I'll go with you. I told her I would think about it. Patricia's house is a modest 2-story bungalow with a small porch in front. Yellow trim lines the quaint brick exterior. Cute, I say as Bobby pulls the car up the slightly inclined driveway. She nods in agreement. We've been in the car for more than 2 hours since our last pit stop, and I know that Bobby's long legs are killing her. She practically leaps out of the driver's seat and stretches for a moment on the driveway. I am more taciturn, realizing all at once that we are here. We are here, which means that in just a moment, I will gather myself, walk down the concrete pathway to the front door, and knock. And the woman on the other side will be the one who gave birth to me and relinquished me shortly thereafter. The woman I have been conversing with weekly on the phone these past 2 months, as well as trading letters with. When Bobby and I had determined that we would in fact make the trip, I realized that we would need money for gas and other incidentals like food. My work-study job at the college would not cover these expenses, so I reluctantly acknowledged that I would need to ask Patricia to cover them if I was going to go. When I did, she did not react well, saying that she would have to think about it, and hung up on me shortly afterwards. Later, she called me back to apologize, saying that she had been taken advantage of so many times in her life and was overcautious because of it. But after talking about it with her partner, Josephine, she saw that it was a reasonable request and one that she could grant. I leaned my head against the cool car window, its icy edges calming my increasingly hot skin. I think about my parents back home in Ann Arbor, who were incredibly hurt when I told them about the search, and my brothers who don't understand why I need to do it at all. If I'm honest, I'm not sure I do either. And yet they have loaned me their car. They have somehow found a way to listen to my stories of non-identifying information, central registries, and now reunion. There's a sharp tap on the window and I'm broken from my reverie. Bobby pulls back her gloved hand and asks me if I'm okay through the muffled glass. I nod, grafting an awkward smile across my face. Apparently satisfied, Bobby steps under the porch awning. Then she digs for something in her purse, waiting for me. I undo my seatbelt and prepare to open the door. But when I look past her, I see the strangest thing. 2 houses down, a young woman runs down the front steps of a house. She is bundled in a brown jacket that looks much too small for her and a knitted red hat that looks like a misshapen mushroom. But it's the way she walks that catches my attention, studied and forceful, like she's determined to get something from the world. Her walk is my own. I don't know how I know it, but I do. I push open the door quickly and stand up, the shock of the cold piercing every cell of my body. Could she be her? The girl on the other side of the wormhole I saw all those years ago? I don't know where this thought comes from, but it appears and stays, defiant. The girl is walking quickly toward a rusted old yellow VW Bug parked at the curb. A girl who looks much shorter and Latina sits behind the wheel. When she hears my car door slam, the girl who is me and not me turns. When her eyes meet mine, they widen in surprise. And I know she is thinking the same thing as me. What the fuck is going on? Is that me? Because she has my face, or I have hers, or something. Maybe Patricia had twins. Maybe we were separated at birth, and this girl, my sister, is being raised by family here while I was given up. I rub my eyes because I want to make sure I'm awake, not dreaming, and I hear the girl in the VW shout something in Spanish through the open shotgun seat window. Shannon, Bobby is saying to me. I force myself to focus on the clear, familiar sound of her voice, grounding me. Reluctantly, I break my glance with my twin and address Bobby. Her brown eyes are filled with worry. Did you see that? I ask. See what? Bobby asks, her mask a face of confusion. Look, right there, I say, pointing to the girl who was frozen on the steps only moments before. But she's not there anymore. I gasp as the rusted VW Bug chugs past us, its windows all rolled up and foggy. It's impossible to see anyone inside. That is an old car, says Bobby. I kind of can't believe it still runs. But I saw her. I know it was her, I say. And before I know what's happening, I'm running out into the street, chasing the car. Hey, stop, I yell. I know it's her. I know it's me. Bobby runs out to the middle of the street where I am and grabs my arm. This stops me from running. Hey, she says as I slam into her, stop. I look past her shoulder at the spot of yellow that finally turns the corner and is gone. I sigh, deflated. What just happened? Bobby asks. I've never told her about the wormhole, the other me on the other side, or the second incident with my birth father. I've wanted to many times, but I was worried about what she would think of me. And to be honest, I was wondering if any of it had actually happened after all these years. I thought I saw someone, I tell her weakly. She lets go of my arm and takes a step back. Someone, I sigh again. Someone I've seen before. She looks at me strangely, like she doesn't know who I am. I look down at my feet and dig for words. Someone who reminds me. She's gone now, but maybe I can find her again, especially if she's so close. I look back up at Bobby, her big clear plastic glasses reflecting the late afternoon sun. I catch a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turn and see two women pushing a curtain aside and peering at us curiously in the middle of the street. My face reddens. Forget it. Let's go, I tell Bobby. Then I turn on my heel and stride down the walk with as much confidence as I can muster. This was not the way I wanted to meet her. I stand in front of a simple oak door, a Christmas wreath decorated with holly and red ribbon, and a wood carving of children on a sled hangs in the middle. My heart thwacking like a hammer in my chest, I raise my right hand and knock 3 times. Once I do, Bobby is beside me, standing tall as always, hands clasped behind her back. She is nervous too, I realize. The door flies open abruptly, and then she is there. An average-sized white woman with short blonde hair that stops just above her ears and bangs that have been curled specially and sprayed in place. Her nose is thin and long. I can see that I inherited it. Her eyes are cautious, which I expected, but I can also see that at one point they were easygoing, overflowing with wonder at the world. But life has done its work on her, and she is different now. Hi, I say. It feels idiotic, but it's what you say. Hi, she says, and her voice is low, gravelly. I've heard it on the phone these last few months, but somehow it didn't seem so heavy to me over the line. More than 20 years later, after she has died from something called anaplastic carcinoma, I will learn that she smokes 2 packs a day, but hides it from me the whole time we are in reunion. Now, however, not having had much exposure to smoking or smokers, I don't make the connection. We made it, I say. The wind whips up around Bobby and I shiver. You're taller than I expected, she says abruptly. I laugh. I'm 5'7", but Bobby is 5'11 and a half, and when your best friend is so much taller than you, you don't think of yourself as tall. She keeps staring, taking me in. A thick white woman with curly blonde hair and a welcoming smile steps from behind her. Well, let them in, Patricia, she says with a laugh. Oh my God, what am I thinking? I'm not, says Patricia, and she gestures for us to come inside. We do, and the warmth of the house envelops us, as does Christmas music playing on the stereo in the next room. I look around and see that the whole house is covered in holiday decorations, from the manger ornaments on the hearth to the gingerbread men stickers on the windows to the plastic holly and ivy taped to the molding. Patricia's eyes follow my own, noting everything that catches my attention. We're a little obsessed with Christmas in this house, she says, laughing nervously. You know, your Irish Catholic roots and all. I want to say that my adoptive family is Irish Catholic too, and we don't even have a fourth of this stuff up around the holidays, but I don't. Instead, I smile and tell my birth mother that she has a beautiful home. I'll stop there. Thank you.
I really can't wait for the rest of this, Shannon. I've heard, 2 snips now, thanks to this lovely program, and I want to see how it all ties together. I was getting all goosebumpy on my head with the you, but not you, and I don't know, it's very good. I love it. So our next friend this evening will be Christopher Lehmann, who teaches at St. Cloud State, and his book Slavery's Reach won the award in Minnesota history last year. So Christopher, welcome.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This is quite an honor. And I guess the best way to have me talk about the book is to talk about my fascination with genealogy. I've been studying my family tree for a little over 20 years now. So I will try to share that right now. Okay, so this is a family tree, and here I am. And then we go to parents, grandparents, great, great, great. And where my last name Lehman comes from is this person from France, but whose parents came from Germany, Isaac Lehmann. And he came to the United States to Louisiana in the late 1850s. And in 1864, while his half-brothers were fighting in the Civil War, Isaac made a baby with one of his half-brother's slaves, Mary Charlotte. And that baby is my great-great-grandfather, Paul Lehman. So he's the first African-American to have the Lehman last name. So that's where my surname comes from. Now, this branch of my family tree is more relevant to the book. And I actually didn't know that when I wrote the book, because when I moved to Minnesota in 2002, there was no family here. It was just the family that I brought with me, my first wife and my son, my oldest son. And so I came to the state knowing nobody at all. So when I did the book Slavery's Reach and all my other research about Minnesota, up until last year, it had been very impersonal, very detached. I just thought that I was doing a local history because this is where I live. But when I was doing my family tree research, right after I had finished writing Slavery's Reach and I sent my last proof off to the press and was done with it, I found a deed from St. Louis, Missouri. And the deed was from 1792, and it was from, well, it was about my fifth great-grandmother, Veronique. And the deed said that a man named Sylvester Labadie had sold her to Zenon Trudeau, who was the Spanish leader of the colony Upper Louisiana, which included what later became Minnesota. So I looked at the deed and I thought to myself, I've seen that name, Sylvester Labadie. Where have I seen that name before? And it took me a few hours until I realized that I had written about Labadie on page 17 of my book. Sylvester Labadie was the grandfather of one of the partners of Choteau and Company that owned American Fur, whose agents sold furs from Minnesota. So there was this connection that my family has to the information that I just put in my book, and I didn't know about it the whole time that I was writing the book. And then I later found out that Zenon Trudeau has descendants who are Gary Trudeau, who does the Doonesbury comic strip, and the leader of Canada, Justin Trudeau. So this was quite a find that I had stumbled upon last year. But I figured I wrote the book that I wrote, and I was happy with what I wrote. I don't know that I could make it a more personal book now. So I suppose if I wanted to include that kind of history, I would just have to write a different book somehow. But I really enjoy doing genealogy, and it has been very important for my research because when you're doing your genealogy and you're the descendant of a slave, there are certain tricks that you have to learn. For example, you have to know who in your family was alive in the year 1870 and where they lived, because the 1870 census was the first census that recorded all African Americans by their first and their last names. Before then, slaves were recorded anonymously in a separate census called a schedule, and the slave schedules only had the name of the owner or the enslaver. And then the slaves that the enslaver owned would be listed anonymously by age, by gender, and by color. B for black, M for mulatto, what we now call biracial. And so if all you have to go on is the 1870 census and that, then you look at the age of your ancestor in 1870, and if you know that someone who has the same last name as your ancestor was the one who enslaved you, and they're in the same town as your ancestor is, you can go to the 1860 schedule, look up someone with that last name, and then look for someone listed anonymously who has the same gender, color, and age minus 10 years. So you start with that, and then if after doing that you're able to figure out any slave ancestor whose master died before 1865, that means that they would have died before legal slavery ended. So if they died, then they would have had a will, or if they didn't have a will, then probate court would have inventoried the property. So it would be in the will or in the probate inventories that a slave would be listed by a first name. And so you could go to your 1870 census with first and last name and see if any of the property that that enslaver listed has the same first name. And so it's this very haphazard research, but when you make those connections, they're really, really powerful connections. So I did a little bit of that with the book Slavery's Reach, but I mostly concentrated on finding real estate deeds. I looked at real estate deeds for counties primarily along the Mississippi River because that was the waterway that connected the North and the South. And I looked at counties that existed before 1865, because if anybody bought and sold land in that county before 1865, and the deed said that that person was from the South, that person could have been a slaveholder. So I looked at the deeds. Every time I saw someone who was a Southerner, I wrote down the name and I wrote down the location. And I would just spend a day at this county office or a day at that county recorder office. And then after my day was done, I would go home and then I would go online to the family tree database or the genealogy database, and I would look up the slave census or the slave schedule and plug in the name of a Southerner from a deed. And if I find that person's name in the slave schedule, that means that that person was a slaveholder. And that means that the real estate deed is this concrete documented proof that money from a farm or a plantation that had slaves transferred hands to a Minnesotan. And so I found lots and lots of these deeds all across Minnesota. And so Slavery's Reach was my attempt to make some kind of sense out of them. And so I'll read a few passages from the book. First of all, the portion of the introduction. From the establishment of Minnesota as a territory in 1849 to the passage of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution in 1865, slaveholders invested in land and businesses in Minnesota. Many of them traveled from their southern homes to make the transactions in person, but others arranged for Minnesotans with power of attorney to facilitate the purchases. The investors' practices spanned the gamut of human possession, represented by yeomen who owned a single enslaved person, elite planners who kept hundreds of people captive, reluctant heirs who manumitted slaves whenever possible, and enthusiastic masters who acquired as many people as possible. It's not surprising that Southerners who were prosperous enough to invest or vacation in Minnesota relied on slaveholding wealth. This is not, however, the point. The recruiting of investors by Minnesota's political leaders, the eagerness of new communities to attract those investments, the participation of financial institutions, the catering to rich tourists, all were part of the web of connections tying Northern development to Southern slavery. Indeed, wealth pouring into Minnesota from the northeastern United States was also made in banking and industries that grew because of the labor of enslaved people. Minnesotans and other Northerners have forgotten their state's complicity in the slaveholding economy, just as some Southerners have denied that the Civil War was fought over slavery. A reader might question the relative level of slaveholder investment in Minnesota land and businesses. Did it comprise 1% or 10% or 40% of all investment in the state? While it is not possible to calculate this figure, it is abundantly clear that people in Minnesota invited, encouraged, and welcomed any investments and expenditures from slaveholders, and broke their own laws in order to facilitate such income. Investments made by slaveholders were crucial to Minnesota's development at times and in specific areas of the state. This book does not argue that slaveholder wealth was the defining element in the growth of the new territory. Instead, it uncovers the ties and demonstrates how Minnesotans allowed illegal slaveholding in their communities and benefited from it. Minnesota was not a distant land, far from the turmoil of 1850s US politics. It was the front lines of the pre-war battle over slavery. In tracing the people, financial institutions, and political entities that brought slaves and slaveholding wealth into the territory and state, this book demonstrates slavery's reach. And one of the things that I found extremely fascinating in my research was that there were so many Minnesotans who later became Confederates. And Minnesota has this very proud history when it comes to the Civil War, being one of the first Union states to be in the Union Army and so forth. But the Confederate history is especially interesting. And as I was looking at how Minnesota covered the Civil War, I was really taken as to just how much Minnesota hates traitors. I mean, Minnesota has this sort of passive aggressive, Minnesota nice kind of vibe to it. But when it came to talking about Minnesotans they knew switching over and becoming Confederates, there was really no love lost. And so my last passage I'll read from will be about Joseph Rosser, who had been the lieutenant governor of Minnesota, but then went back to Virginia where he had slaves and joined the Confederate Army. So a premature obituary in the St. Paul Daily Press on May 2nd, 1863 claimed that he had been killed in battle. The Republican leading newspaper expressed concern over whether it had identified the correct Rosser. If so, there would be no tears shed over his fate, even if his treason had not merited the doom which has befallen him. The paper called Rosser one of the most incorrigible loafers which were ever produced, even in the fruitful soil of Virginia. And the obituary mentioned at length how disliked he was among Republicans in Minnesota. So, never be a traitor if you're in Minnesota. And that is where I will stop.
Thanks, Christopher, for sharing fascinating family research and for illuminating pieces of state history that need light upon them. I always appreciate that. Our final speaker for the first half of the program will be Bao Phi, and he writes and performs poetry and most recently has been writing picture books for children. Welcome, Bao.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us tonight. I'm actually not going to read and I'm going to keep it very short so we can keep to the discussion. I was born in Vietnam to Vietnamese parents just a few months before my family was forced to flee because of the war and its aftermath. We were refugees from Vietnam. I was a baby. I was 3 months old when I left Vietnam under duress of war, and we went from refugee camps to Minnesota, coming to the Phillips neighborhood of South Minneapolis, which those of you who know Minnesota, Phillips is Minneapolis's largest, poorest, and most racially diverse neighborhood. My parents still live there. So I was the youngest in a large, poor refugee family in Phillips. Um, there was a lot of racism and bigotry towards our people, especially in Minnesota, because we were the first large visible groups of Asian people to come together to Minnesota. There were Asian people here before, but like we came here in big groups, right? As refugees and not as immigrants. And so there was a lot of people took out a lot of negative feelings about the war on both sides of the political spectrum on us. They did a lot of polls back then that said, that most Americans, the majority of Americans, did not want refugees. Um, Families like mine, especially in that first wave, were promised by the U.S. government, because the U.S. government, they wanted a democratic stronghold in Asia to counterpoint Russia and China's communism. Okay, and so China and Russia backed the Communist Party. The United States backed families like mine. Now they said that if families like mine helped them, they would take care of us if things went wrong. Well, when things went wrong, they kind of didn't really fulfill their promise. They let some of us in, but they didn't take care of us. They pushed the responsibility of our well-being onto the nonprofit sector. So that's why you'll hear that a lot of uh, Southeast Asians had a Lutheran sponsor in Minnesota. That's how we came here. Um, and also, because they knew Americans did not want us, they intentionally split up Southeast Asian communities and put small pockets of us in different cities, um, basically so white people wouldn't get too upset. And of course, for us, what that tells us is that that also broke up our communities, right? Like it also hampered our ability to be strong communities and take care of each other. And I think the repercussions of all of these things are visible in Southeast Asian refugee communities today. That's a very long way of saying, in addition to that, I was the youngest in a large family coming here during a time when no one wanted us here and took out a lot of misunderstandings on the war on us. And I was a nerd. Okay, like on top of all that, I grew up in a tough neighborhood, small, racially other, even in a neighborhood of a very multiracial neighborhood. I was Southeast Asian, um, and I was a nerd. I love books. I walked to the Franklin Avenue Library all the time because it was 6 blocks from my house, and books were free. I wanted toys, GI Joes, Transformers, all that stuff, just like any other kid. But we were a big poor family. We couldn't afford toys, and that's really where I fell in love with books and writing and really art. Like I actually started drawing when I was 5, and I wanted to be a comic book artist, but I ended up being a writer. Nobody likes writers. Like, okay, so here are my children's books now. um, I wrote these books. So my first one was A Different Pond, illustrated by T Bui. um, the second one was My Footprints, illustrated by Beja Tran. And then I have another one coming up called Hello Mandarin Duck, illustrated by Dion MBD. Look at that. He's so cool. He has initials for his last name. Like whenever you do readings in schools, kids want to meet the illustrator. They don't want to meet the writer. But anyway, I'm telling you this because this is how I came to love story, books, art. I wanted to be a comic book artist. I loved X-Men, because I mean, back then I didn't have a very sharp racial analysis, but I very much understood what it meant to be a freak, right? And so and X-Men played with that, right? When we were kids. So I loved comic books. Now that I'm a children's book author, I wrote because I'm a father, and we're a bookish family, and we've been reading and reading with our child since they were a baby, and I really wanted them to have Asian American characters, and not just like Asian American characters, but like refugee, working class, lower class, in ways that are, I think, very different from the typical narratives we have of who Asian people are in this country. That's really why I started writing. And so, this first the first book is really about class. It's about a dad who goes fishing with his son because, not for fun, but to help put food on the table, right? Um, and then the second book is about a little girl with 2 moms, and she gets bullied for a variety of reasons, because she's a girl, because she's Asian, because she has queer parents. So it's really a book about bullying. And then my third book, which is coming out, is called Hello Mandarin Duck. It looks like it's about a Mandarin duck who's new to the neighborhood, and the cops come and try to take it away. So it's really about deportation, right? Like as those of us who try to, I grew up with Aesop's fables, right? Like you know, like reading the Aesop and how he had to, you know, use animals instead of peoples to avoid getting in trouble, writing about political things. And similarly, when I went back as a junior to Vietnam to study abroad, if you look at Vietnamese folk art, there's a tradition of basically the same thing, where working class artists would be very critical of the ruling colonial class by using animals or other type of things so they wouldn't get busted, right? But I'll just kind of stop there. I just wanted to give you all a little bit of like who I am as a person and why I chose writing.
Vive le nerds! Yay! Oh, and also thank you for taking on that long tradition of using animals to tell important stories. I think that is fantastic, and now I'm very excited about your Mandarin duck book, and everyone should have that for their kiddos. And now we'll have a small question period for our friendly writers here. I will start with one and give the audience a chance to put some things in the chat for us. And I think we've been sort of circling around this a little bit, but maybe this will give us a chance to get into it a bit more deeply. Throughout this series, I've been asking panelists about the sort of big questions that sort of get them into their work. And I think what I'm getting at is a quality of attentiveness in life. And so what fascinates you and what stops you in your tracks and makes you pay attention, and how does it show up in your work?
We can go in the same order, make it easy.
Do it. Yeah.
All right. I think what repeatedly fascinates me is how I have a laughter response to really horrifying things. And for some reason, it feels like that impetus is what sucks me into work. If I have that sort of like tension that, you know, blows out, then I know that I'm in material that that feels important to explore. So that is it's humor that comes from the horrifying. Yeah.
That's really interesting, because I feel like, you know, I got into an online discussion with some folks about, you know, adoptee humor, you know, which a lot of folks in, you know, dominant cultural spaces don't understand, you know, but there's like there's a tradition, particularly amongst, I would say, historically marginalized communities of gallows humor, right? Where it's like, that's how you know, instead of going and hitting somebody, instead of, you know, doing something else harmful to yourself, like drinking or whatever it is, it's like, you're gonna blow off some steam with your friends, you know, with gallows humor. And so it's just a very interesting tension to sort of explore in work. Yeah. Yeah, so for me, it's been really interesting, you know, after the past few years. I've got a dog in the background, if you're wondering what that noise is. She wants to be let out, but I just let her out, and it's not gonna happen right now, buddy. Yeah, I consider myself a mid-career writer at this point, and so, you know, you sort of start to look back on your body of work and you start to see certain patterns. And so, you know, whereas before, I feel like when I was a younger writer, it would be like, oh, well, this is what I'm interested in, right? But then it's just like the creative process is so mysterious in certain ways. There's certain things that you don't see in your conscious mind until you go back and look at them. And so one thing that's really come to the fore recently as I go back and look at things is this idea of fracture, of people like adoptees, who have experienced something in which there's a before and an after. And kind of the terms of that rupture, what does that do to the telling of the story itself? What does that do to the sense of self? What does that do to memory? What does that do to family legacy, to responsibility, ideas of what our responsibilities are to ourselves and to each other? I'll leave it there.
Well, for me, I like pursuing historical threads. I like seeing just how far back I can go with a particular topic that I'm looking at. And I think that started for me in Christmas of 1986, because I was given a fake yellow newspaper that listed all the things that happened on the day that I was born, which was 14th of October, 1973, which happens to be the exact same day George Floyd was born, believe it or not. But I looked at the paper and it said that the World Series was going on between the Oakland A's and New York Mets. Said what the price of milk was. It listed the president as Richard Nixon, and under vice president, it was blank. And I thought that was a typo. And I was trying to figure out, well, let me try to figure out who the president was. And as it turns out, there really was no vice president when I was born, because Nixon's first vice president, Spiro Agnew, had quit 4 days before I was born, and Gerald Ford had not been sworn in until 2 months later. So that was the first research project I ever did. And doing that research about what was going on with Agnew led me to look at Watergate, which led me to look at the Vietnam War, and it just spiraled from there. And those kinds of things happened when I worked on slavery's reach, and probably, well, definitely I wouldn't have found out what I had found out about the University of Minnesota if I hadn't done that spiraling technique, because I was looking up information about another Southern investor when I stumbled upon William Aiken. And then when I learned about Aiken investing money, I learned what was he doing in Minnesota while he was here. And I learned that he loaned the money to the U of M. And then when I tried to figure out what the U of M did with that money, then I found out that they kept it and they never gave all of it back. And then when I tried to find out why, it was because Minnesota passed a law that said it didn't have to, basically. So I just love going back and back and back and really pushing the history and to see how far I can go with it and to see what I can uncover when I do. And I'll stop there.
Thanks. I think like as a writer and as a person, you just have to have your eyes open, and you have to be ready to experience anything at any given time. Like, the other day when it snowed, I was doing the pandemic grocery shopping, and I was sitting at a red light, and I was like, man, this sucks. But then I looked, to my right, and there was a woman who was walking her dog silhouetted in a, street light, and this little dog that she had on a leash was just going nuts. Like, it was so happy, right? Like, it was so happy and amazing, and that was such a bright spot suddenly that I had not expected. um and so that's always like something that's guided my writing. My first book, A Different Pond, um it's about a father, fishing with his son, and the drive behind it was, you know um my daughter at a very early age was showing that she did not know how to conceptualize what being Asian meant racially. And you know, she doesn't grow. She's not in an all-white area. She's a it's a very diverse area. It's going to the invisibility of Asian American people, and you know, Asian American people are already invisible in this culture. And then people like her grandparents, my parents, you know, working class refugees are even more invisible than most Asian Americans are. And so I wanted to create something that honored that generation struggle, right? Of that unseen generation struggle. That was my first book. I knew I wanted to write a second book. If I got a chance to write a second book, I knew I wanted it to be about bullying. I knew what the heart of it was, but I didn't know what story I wanted to tell. And I had taken my daughter up on a work vacation trip up north, and she started stomping her boots in the snow and chanting my footprints. Um, and I watched her doing that and I was delighted. And I thought to myself, what if I wrote a bullying story about a girl with two moms who's Asian American and she makes footprints and imagines them as different creatures that have different strengths that protect them from bullying and hurt, right? Um, and then my third book, I knew I wanted to address deportation, but again, what's the story, right? And I thought about years ago, my partner and I at the time lived across from Powderhorn, and we would go on walks at night, and there was this you know, one of those old school water pumps. It's like metal, and there's like a concrete block, and you just pump it, and then water comes out. There was one of those on Powderhorn Hill, and there was like a muddy puddle that had formed, and then there was this duck just standing there, like this is my puddle. You know what I mean? And we were just like, what the heck? Look, there's a whole pond, and all your people, you know, like all your duck people are like just that way. Are you lost? And this duck was like, no. And every time we came back for like a week, this duck was there. We would feed it and stuff like that. And so, you know, I was thinking about deportation, and I was like, oh, what if there is an invasive species, right, of duck that comes, and all of these different kids of all these different races say hello to it in all their different languages, and then the Department of Natural Resources or Forestry or whatever come and try to take the duck, and these kids like just band together and save the duck. You know, like I feel like as a writer, like you it's like you're a tuning fork, and you always have to be open to receiving all of these things, and be able to relate them at some point, right? Because you never know. Like we didn't feed that duck because I thought I was gonna, you know, write a book about deportation about it someday, right? um, so if that answers your question.
That's absolutely, yeah, that's fantastic. Thank you, all of you. I enjoy the different ways that just moving through life comes out in writers' work, and whether that's something as simple as what are you doing in the mud puddle, duck, or really looking at the patterns that appear again and again, or and fantastic. I love, Christopher, I love hearing you talk about the way you research things, because it makes me think about why I can't ever finish a project, because I get stuck in those rabbit holes, and they're too much fun, and I'm like drowning in following the thread back and back and back and back. But it's so important, because you get that whole picture, and you understand the way things come together. Appreciate that. We've got a question from Reginald in the chat, and I think we can take this in any number of ways. But what would be the next steps after writing your first book? So both mechanically, I imagine, but maybe also, what did you do after you finished your first book? How did that feel? I'm gonna tack that one. I'm gonna tack that one on.
Shall we continue the rounds? I mean, I suppose it depends on the kind of book that you're writing. For fiction, you know, the next step after you finish it is to probably, and this sounds horrible, recognize the many ways in which you've failed the original dream of the book. and giving yourself time and patience to make sure that it can be as good as you would like it to be, because it's it's wonderful to finish that draft, and you want to celebrate. And I always assumed that I would finish that draft and it would turn into like a 1990s hip hop video. But then there's so much work that comes after that. And so, I think, Shannon, you recommended the Loft manuscript service. That would be a wonderful next step for a manuscript that's finished, and you need to get somebody else's eyes on it. I think having someone else take a look is a really good next step for sure.
And then usually, it's like Maui. Okay. Usually, once you have a working draft, then, it gets to a certain point in the revisions and the drafting where you feel like, okay, this is somewhat cohesive and coming together. And then usually what happens is people approach an agent or a publisher at that point. But I always tell people you have to separate the writing and the publishing. Those are really different things, and they're just really, you have to have different investments in them as well. I mean, I love writing. I wouldn't do it if I didn't love it, but it's very hard to do it well. But publishing is just super hard. It just is for everyone. And then if you come from a historically marginalized community, it's even harder on top of that. So because of the whiteness of it, and all the middle classness of it, all of it. So yeah, those are just some things to keep in mind. I mean, I feel like I wish that I had not started sending out stuff. Like when I did, I wish that I had just, I mean, I was always reading, I was always working on my stuff, and then also I was sending it out. I wish that I had just given myself the okay to not send stuff out until years later, actually. Because it's just a different, it can be really stressful, and it's just a different, it's just a whole different process.
Well, I think for me, when I finished my first book, I felt relief more than anything else, because I had tied my finishing of a book and having it published with my career as a professor. And I had spent basically my first 5 years at St. Cloud State trying to get a book out, because I was up for tenure in that 5th year. And I've heard all sorts of stories about how difficult it is for professors of color to get tenure, especially on the first try. And I figured that since I was teaching at a place that was more driven by how well you teach versus how productive you are with articles and so forth, that if I had a book out, then not just an article, that would give me an edge when I came up for tenure. So when I wrote my first book, it was with that in mind, just trying to get it out by that 5th year. So it didn't really take much time to enjoy it when it came out. I just felt that it's good that it's out, so now I can put it on my tenure application. So in the years that I've written since then, I've really tried to appreciate the writing process more, and to appreciate my publishers as well. And I've also learned to be a much better storyteller than when I first started writing, because I came from a place where I had wanted to write reference books, almost encyclopedia-like. And I had thought that just finding information that I thought was exciting would be enough. But then when I learned about narrative and developing compelling characters and so forth, then I knew that the early books that I had written were not very strong in that. So I really wanted to have the things that I was writing be memorable and to have people that the readers could identify with. And so I think with Slavery's Reach being my sixth book, the six times the charm, perhaps.
To answer that question, I have to go back. So, before I started writing children's books, I had been a spoken word poet for many years, for decades. And the short version of the story is that there was a lot of chauvinism about spoken word poets, slam poets, that we were entertaining, but we weren't strong on the page. That's how people dismissed our art, right? And so for many years, I was actually getting paid to come and perform and speak. This was before YouTube, right? Um, and so I was getting paid a fair amount of money to go do speaking and performance engagements. And I figured because of the chauvinism against us, I would never have a book published. I wasn't aggressive about sending my poems out to get published. I didn't ever send a manuscript out. I was 33 when or 30 I was 33 when my manuscript was accepted by Coffee House Press. Alan Kornblum, may he rest in peace, had asked for my manuscript, I believe on the strength of he had known that I had been performing for close to a decade or more than a decade at that point. And so he knew he knew that I had built an audience for my work. You know what I mean? And that's really how I came to have my first book of poetry. And I say that because number one, those of us who are spoken word and slam poets, we always just assumed that the gatekeepers would never accept us. And so we built a model of success and a model of art outside of the traditional modes of publishing. You know what I mean? And sometimes you have to do that, slam spoken word that was built, most of us were from marginalized communities. We were like working class women, Black, Native American, Asian American, Latino, Latina, Arab, basically we were like the misfits, right? Um, so a lot of us came from marginalized communities who never assumed that these institutions would ever support us. And so, we had built a level of success. And I'm guessing that if I had not slowly over time built an audience for myself, I doubt that I would get published my book of poems. And so, I would say that, success, sometimes you have to build your own road to success if it is denied to you.
Fantastic, well-rounded answers to a great question. Thank you, writers. Audience, I would like to give you another chance to ask anything before we close up tonight. I know I don't want to keep our friends here too much longer, but I have appreciated all of the time spent with all of you this evening in so many ways. It's been inspiring as usual. These events have been, this is the last of the Moving Words events for our season. It's been a great way to spend some time in this bizarre COVID riddled landscape that we find ourselves in, and I appreciate all of you for being here with us this evening. Again, audience, I will be sending you a brief survey, so please do take some time to fill that out. Writers, thank you so much for your time this evening. Grand Rapids are great. Where are we now? We were in Grand Rapids last week. We're in Great River Regional Library. I don't even know where I am anymore. Nothing matters. Thank you for your partnership on this. We do have the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library has an event with Louise Erdrich coming up on December 8th. We would love it for you to join us for that. That's part of our One Book, One Minnesota program. And I hope we see you all again very soon. Writers, thank you so much for your time and your generosity this evening. Shannon's children have been delightful. Thank you all for being real with your lives. I appreciate that as well. So
Thank you all. Have a great night.
Bye bye. Get a question.
Bye-bye.